What they hid from their masters shocks even modern historians. We are used to thinking of Roman slaves as powerless people who only worked and suffered. But archaeological discoveries in recent decades have revealed a completely different picture. Slaves had their own secret lives, hidden from the eyes of their masters. They created underground networks, accumulated wealth, and organized uprisings. Some slaves lived better than free citizens. Today we will tell you 10 shocking facts about the secret life of Roman slaves. Watch until the end. The last secret will show how slaves could become richer than their owners. The first secret of Roman slavery was the existence of peculium, a special system that allowed slaves to own property even though they had no rights under the law. Formally, everything a slave owned belonged to his master, but in practice, many accumulated considerable fortunes and skillfully managed them. The peculium was formed in various ways. It was based on gifts from masters for good service, small earnings from additional assignments, and income from crafts or trade. More enterprising slaves turned tiny sums into entire fortunes, using their knowledge of arithmetic, trade connections, and accounting skills. For many, this was the only way to gain at least some independence. Archaeological finds confirm the scale of slave savings. A treasure trove was discovered in Pompeii, apparently belonging to a slave cook. The sum of 50,000 sesterces could provide a free craftsman with a living for 20 years. This shows that even those who occupied a modest position could become rich people with the right savvy. Slave managers and financiers played a special role. They were entrusted with managing their master's capital, but often they skillfully put these funds to work for themselves. Managers of large estates controlled capital worth hundreds of thousands of sesterces, engaged in usury, and invested in commercial enterprises through frontmen. Some of them had influence comparable to that of free entrepreneurs. There are known cases when slaves were richer than their masters. For example, the slave Caecilius Jucunda, who managed a bank in Pompeii, had a fortune of over 1,000,000 sesterces. His wax tablets with debt receipts are still a valuable source of knowledge about the financial system of Rome and demonstrate that even slaves could be at the center of economic operations. The main purpose of accumulating peculium was to buy freedom. Many slaves saved money for decades to buy freedom for themselves, their spouses, or their children. The price depended on the profession and value of the slave, from 500 to 10,000 sesterces. For skilled professionals, doctors, teachers, or craftsmen, this amount could be astronomical, but for a wealthy slave, it was achievable. Storing wealth required special ingenuity. Slaves hid money in the walls of houses, in vessels, and built hiding places under the floors. More experienced slaves used secret bank accounts registered in the names of trusted free citizens or freedmen. Such secrecy was necessary. The owner could take away the peculium at any moment. Not only men, but also female slaves actively participated in the accumulation of property. They traded in fabrics, jewelry, cosmetics, and provided small services. Female slaves who were prostitutes in wealthy households could accumulate sums in a few years that were inaccessible even to free citizens. Sometimes the peculium became family capital that was passed on to children. Although legally controversial, in practice many slave families created entire dynasties of wealthy slaves, passing on not only money but also knowledge, commercial connections, and secrets of accumulation. The paradox of the system was that a slave, who formally had no rights, could be a real participant in the economy and sometimes even its driving force. Some imperial slaves managed state finances, collected taxes, and administered provincial budgets. Thus, peculium turned slaves into shadow players in the Roman economy. It was not just a privilege, but a real loophole that allowed slaves to go beyond their status. The peculium system shows that the line between slavery and freedom in Rome was much thinner than it seems at first glance. The second secret of Roman life is not related to weapons and conquests, but to the inner world of those who were most often deprived of their right to privacy. We are talking about Contubernales, unofficial marriages between slaves. Formally, Roman law did not recognize slave marriages. A slave was the property of his master and had neither legal personality nor civil rights. However, despite the laws and social restrictions, slaves formed strong family unions that could last for decades, survive generational changes, and even leave behind a cultural legacy. Slave families were formed according to the same principles as families of free citizens. A man and a woman announced their union in the presence of witnesses, exchanged gifts, and held small feasts. Of course, the scale of such weddings was more modest, but the symbolism remained. It was important that this union was recognized by the slave community and, in some cases, by the owner. Many owners encouraged such marriages, considering them a guarantee of stability and predictability. Family slaves worked harder and were less likely to try to escape. Archaeological finds confirm the existence of multi-generational slave families. Burials have been discovered in villas in Campania and Sicily where parents, children, and grandchildren who were slaves with the same names were laid to rest side by side. Such continuity indicates the existence of traditions, care for the memory of ancestors, and the preservation of family identity, even in conditions of slavery. Slave spouses referred to each other as Contubernales, which literally meant tent mate or cohabitant. These relationships had no legal force, but they were recognized by society and recorded in inscriptions. The tombstones of slaves bear touching lines dedicated to beloved spouses and children, testifying to the depth of emotional ties. Children born into such unions automatically became slaves to their mother's master. But even in these conditions, parents fought for their future. They saved money to buy their freedom, negotiated manumission with their masters, gave their children an education, and taught them a profession. There were many cases when the children of slaves became free and continued family traditions as freedmen. Separating families when selling slaves was a common practice. However, many masters tried to avoid this, not out of humanity, but for profit. Separated slaves were more likely to run away, lose their ability to work, and be less loyal. Family ties, on the contrary, made slaves more predictable and attached to the place. Children born from relationships between female slaves and their masters or their sons occupied a special place. Formally, they remained slaves, but they had a higher status and were more often freed. Such children often received a good upbringing and education and sometimes became heirs to the estate. This was common in Roman society, and many famous people came from such unions. There was also a system of nurses, experienced female slaves who took care of children. They were held in high esteem and enjoyed privileges. They were exempt from hard labor, lived in better conditions, and became the guardians of the family hearth in the slave community. It was in these unions, hidden from official history, that human resilience and the desire to preserve identity manifested themselves. Contubernalia were not just a form of coexistence. They became a symbol of the fact that even in conditions of complete dependence, people sought and found love, family, and the memory of their ancestors. The third secret of Roman slavery was the existence of Collegia, secret organizations that united slaves on the basis of profession, ethnicity, or religion. These unions formed a parallel social structure in the shadows, independent of the official authority of their masters. Colleges arose around common interests and origins. Slave bakers and craftsmen formed their own associations, separate from slave gladiators. Egyptians formed communities distinct from the Gauls or Syrians, and Christians gathered separately from the worshippers of Mithras or Isis. This division gave everyone the opportunity to preserve the identity and traditions of their homeland, even while in slavery. Membership in a collegium provided protection and mutual assistance. The unions helped their members in difficult times. They organized funerals for the deceased, cared for the sick, and supported families left without a breadwinner. For many slaves, the collegium was the only guarantee that they would not be forgotten in case of misfortune. The financial basis of the guilds was built on membership fees and income from joint ventures. Some unions owned workshops, shops, and real estate. Formally, all this was registered to freedmen or free patrons, but in fact, it was controlled by slaves. Thanks to this, the guilds had real resources and could finance assistance, celebrations, and sometimes even escapes. The leadership of the Collegia was elected from among the most experienced and respected slaves. These leaders wielded enormous influence within their communities, settled disputes, convened meetings, and coordinated resistance to unjust masters. Their authority was sometimes greater than that of the overseers. Meetings were held in secluded places, basements of houses, abandoned buildings, remote corners of ports and markets. Here, pressing issues were discussed, religious ceremonies were held, newcomers were trained, and conflicts were resolved. Sometimes it was in these very places that plans for uprisings or mass escapes were hatched. The collegiums created an entire information network covering the entire empire. Sailors, merchants, and messengers passed news from one group to another. Rumors about cruel masters, upcoming inspections, or uprisings spread faster than official orders. Thanks to this, slaves knew about events in different provinces and could act in concert. Each collegium had its own code of rules. Mutual aid was considered a sacred duty, and betrayal was punishable by exile or even death. The significance of the Collegia was enormous. They formed an alternative system of power, supported the slave economy and culture, and provided a link between generations. Even after gaining their freedom, many freedmen continued to support their Collegia, considering them their second family. Thus, the Collegia were not just secret slave unions, but a full-fledged underground structure of society that allowed slaves to preserve their dignity, sense of community, and faith in the future. Escaping slavery in Rome was rarely an act of desperation, where a person simply ran away as fast as they could. In fact, in many cases, it was a carefully planned operation that required preparation, allies, and an entire support network. There was a ramified and, in its own way, professional system of escape covering the major cities and provinces of the empire. Escape organizers existed almost everywhere. They were either free people who sympathized with slaves or freed slaves themselves who knew the laws and roads. They bribed guards, negotiated with transporters, and created a system of secret shelters. They charged a lot of money for their services, from 10 to 50% of the slave's value, sometimes entirely through the peculium, the slave's personal savings. Preparations for escape could take months. Slaves gathered supplies of food, warm clothing, and sometimes weapons. They studied the roads, looked for safe river crossings, and negotiated with innkeepers. Some specifically learned a trade, blacksmithing, carpentry, or weaving, to have a chance to earn a living in freedom. Fake documents played a huge role. Educated slave scribes or runaway notaries produced false certificates of freedom, letters of recommendation from imaginary patrons, and even fake travel documents for crossing provincial borders. Such documents could save a fugitive's life if they were stopped by a patrol. Group escapes were much more successful than solo ones. Usually 5-10 people would gather and divide up roles. One was responsible for food, another for scouting the route, and a third for security. If they were attacked by slave catchers, the group could fight back. In addition, the moral support of their comrades increased their chances of survival. Escape routes were formed over many years. There were entire secret trails, similar to the future Underground Railroad in America. During the day, the fugitives hid in forests or caves, and at night they walked to the next shelter. Sometimes they were helped by communities of freedmen or sympathetic farmers who themselves hated slavery. Escapes by sea were especially popular in port cities. Slaves were hidden in the holds of merchant ships or agreed with captains to work as sailors. This made it possible to reach distant provinces or even beyond the empire, to the lands of barbarians where Roman power did not extend. Sanctuaries and temples played a special role. They were considered inviolable. A fugitive slave could hide there for a while. Sometimes priests negotiated with the owner to soften his decision or buy out the slave. In other cases, the temple became a transit point for further escape. Disguise and changing clothes were an essential part of any escape. Men shaved their hair or beards, women changed into men's clothes. Literate slaves pretended to be free craftsmen or freedmen, illiterate ones, merchants, or foreigners. Many learned foreign accents to pass themselves off as natives of another province. Female slaves had their own special ways to freedom. Some married free people, others used the patronage of wealthy townspeople, or joined religious sects where they received protection. Pregnancy could temporarily protect them from being sold or punished, giving them time to escape. Escapes were financed in various ways. Through the savings of slaves, the help of collegia, i.e., slave brotherhoods, and the support of sympathetic citizens. The cost of an escape depended on its complexity, ranging from 100 to 1,000 sesterces. This was a colossal sum, and therefore successful escapes were more often achieved by those who had connections and support. The risks were enormous. Captured fugitives were branded, put in chains, and sold to quarries or gladiatorial arenas. Some were branded with the letters fug, from the word fugitivus, meaning fugitive. However, this did not deter the desperate. There are known cases of slaves making 5 to 6 attempts to escape before achieving freedom. The history of Roman slaves shows that escape was not only a manifestation of despair, but also a testament to resilience, solidarity, and ingenuity. Behind every successful escape was a whole network of allies, resources, and knowledge. It was an invisible war within the empire that lasted for centuries and left its mark on the cultural memory of peoples. The fifth secret of Roman society was the rich and diverse world of secret religious cults among slaves. Formerly, they were all required to worship the gods of their masters, make sacrifices on official holidays, and participate in state ceremonies. But the reality was different. Slaves created their own religious system, mixing the traditions of dozens of peoples of the empire. These secret beliefs became a source of hope, inner freedom, and resistance. Eastern cults were especially popular among slaves because they promised salvation, eternal life, and equality before the gods. The cult of Mithras promised victory over evil. The cult of Isis promised maternal protection. The cult of Cybele promised a connection with nature and rebirth. And early Christianity introduced the idea that every person, even a slave, has value in the eyes of God. These religions gave slaves comfort and a sense that their suffering on earth was not in vain. The syncretism of slave beliefs gave rise to unique religious systems. The Egyptian Isis was identified with the Greek Demeter and the Roman Venus, the Persian Mithras with the Roman Sol Invictus, and the Christian Messiah was sometimes perceived as a continuation of ancient prophecies about heroic liberators. New myths were born within slave communities, combining the gods, legends, and symbols of different peoples. Secret places of worship existed in almost every major city. These could be underground Mithraea, sanctuaries of Mithras, hidden altars in forests or cemeteries, or sanctuaries in abandoned buildings. In such places, slaves gathered at night, by candlelight and torchlight, to pray together, sing hymns, make sacrifices, and perform mysteries. Many such temples have survived to this day, hidden under layers of urban ruins. Priests from among the slaves played a crucial role in religious life. They performed rituals, kept sacred symbols, interpreted dreams and omens, and read sacred texts. Some of them had such authority that even free people listened to them. Within slave communities, the priest became a spiritual leader, guardian of traditions, and mentor. The religious holidays of slaves did not coincide with official calendar celebrations. They celebrated the days of their gods, held night ceremonies, organized communal meals, and shared food and wine. These holidays united hundreds of slaves and gave them a sense of strength and solidarity that they so lacked in their daily lives. Mysteries and initiations created a special hierarchy. Those initiated into secret knowledge received special status, respect, and spiritual superiority. For many slaves, this was the only way to achieve social growth, not in real life, but in spiritual life. Entering into the mystery became a symbol of a second inner freedom. Prophecies and predictions were an important part of slave religiosity. Prophets spoke of imminent liberation, the fall of cruel masters, and the coming of the Messiah. These prophecies gave slaves strength and inspired them to resist. Sometimes it was religious leaders who organized uprisings. Magic and witchcraft were an integral part of religious practice. Slaves made amulets to ward off illness and beatings, divine the future, brewed potions, and cursed their enemies. Witchcraft gave them a sense of control over their destiny, at least symbolically. Religious texts of slaves were rarely written down and were more often transmitted orally. Sometimes educated slaves recorded them on papyrus or tablets using coded expressions. These texts contained messages of resistance and hope for freedom. Thus, the secret religious cults of slaves became not just a consolation, but a real spiritual support, a form of resistance, and a way to preserve human dignity. They created an invisible network of solidarity that strengthened slaves and helped them survive in conditions where the official religion only reinforced their enslavement. The sixth secret of the Roman world is that slaves had their own rich culture of entertainment, which developed in parallel with the official spectacles of the empire. Despite their harsh living conditions, lack of rights, and constant control, they created their own forms of leisure, games, theatrical performances, and sporting competitions. This hidden culture became a way to preserve humanity, express emotions, and strengthen a sense of community. Gladiator schools were not only places for training fighters, but also true centers of slave culture. Inside these harsh establishments, gambling, musical evenings, and improvised skits flourished. Gladiators, who enjoyed a special status, became idols for other slaves, symbols of strength and hope. Many of them composed songs, held competitions in singing and playing instruments, and sometimes even created their own small theaters. Underground fights between slaves were held in ports, markets, and suburbs. These competitions were less bloody than official gladiatorial games and more often resembled sports wrestling. But the spectacle and excitement surrounding them were enormous. Spectators placed bets, cheered loudly, and celebrated the victories of their comrades. The musical culture of slaves was remarkably diverse. It intertwined the traditions of different peoples. African drums were combined with Gallic flutes, Egyptian harps with German horns, and Greek kitharas with Syrian percussion instruments. This mixture gave rise to a unique cosmopolitan music that was found nowhere else in the empire. The music of the slaves was heard at festivals, in workshops, and even during hard work. Dancing occupied a special place in slave culture. Some dances were ritualistic and associated with ancestor worship or secret rites, while others were purely for entertainment. At feasts, couples and group dances were performed, sometimes in a humorous form, parodying the habits of the masters. Dance became a way of courtship, a form of protest and a means of self-expression. Theatrical performances by slaves often ridiculed the vices of Roman citizens and depicted dreams of freedom. These were short scenes, satirical plays, or retellings of legends from their native lands. Theater played not only an entertaining, but also an educational role. It reminded slaves of their roots, history, and hope for a better life. Gambling was a real passion. Dice, pebbles, coins, and homemade game boards were used. The stakes were food, clothing, and small amounts of money from the peculium. Sometimes slaves risked everything, losing the savings they hoped would buy their freedom. Games helped them forget their troubles, but sometimes became a source of conflict. Sports competitions were another important element of leisure. Slave communities organized competitions in running, wrestling, javelin throwing, and swimming. The winners received prizes from their colleagues and the respect of their comrades. For some, such successes opened the way to the attention of their masters and even the chance of freedom. Holidays and birthdays were occasions for communal feasts. They were accompanied by music, dancing, games, and theatrical performances. Even in the most difficult conditions, slaves knew how to find reasons for joy, and holidays strengthened their sense of unity and mutual assistance. Children's games were of particular importance. Slaves' children played masters and slaves, learned crafts through play, and listened to tales of heroes who had gained their freedom. These games conveyed cultural traditions, memories of ancestors, and hope for the future. Love games and courtship also had their own rules. Young people met at holidays through intermediaries or at work. Songs, dances, and symbolic gifts expressed feelings. Even in slavery, romance existed, and the union of two people often grew into a long-term relationship recognized by the community. Thus, entertainment for slaves was not just a way to kill time. It served important social functions. It strengthened solidarity, preserved cultural memory, provided an escape from the harsh realities of everyday life, and helped slaves feel like people, not objects. It was a parallel world in which Roman slaves retained their dignity and identity. The seventh secret of Roman slaves was the system of transferring professional knowledge and secret craft techniques. Master slaves created closed communities that jealously guarded their secrets from their masters and competitors. The culinary secrets of slave cooks were passed down orally from master to apprentice. Recipes for exotic dishes, methods of preparing poisons and antidotes, and methods of preserving food constituted valuable knowledge that could be sold or exchanged. The medical knowledge of slaves often surpassed that of free doctors. Slaves from Egypt possessed the secrets of mummification, Syrians, the art of surgery, and Germans, herbalism. This knowledge was carefully hidden from outsiders. Slave craftsmanship included unique methods of metalworking, paint making, and leather tanning. Many secrets were never revealed. They died with their keepers or were taken away by escaped slaves. The construction skills of slave architects and engineers allowed them to erect structures whose technologies remain a mystery to this day. The secrets of Roman concrete and methods of transporting huge blocks were known mainly to slaves from the eastern provinces. The organization of training among slaves was strictly structured. Masters selected apprentices, tested their abilities and loyalty, and gradually revealed secrets. Betrayal by an apprentice was punishable by expulsion from the professional community. The eighth secret of Roman society was the existence of extensive trade networks controlled by slaves. Despite formal prohibitions and the lack of legal rights to conduct business, slaves actively participated in commercial life, creating their own trading empires hidden from the authorities. These networks covered dozens of cities and operated in parallel with the official economy of the empire. Trade between slave communities was well established and surprisingly organized. Slaves exchanged goods, money, information, and services. They maintained constant contact with associations of freedmen and used their connections among artisans and sailors. This system functioned almost like a separate state within a state. Smuggling became the basis of many operations. Slaves smuggled jewels, spices, fabrics, exotic animals, and weapons across borders. Their low social status served as a cover. Soldiers and officials rarely suspected slaves of involvement in large transactions. Port slaves who had access to ships and cargo were particularly successful. Usury flourished in slave quarters. Rich slaves gave loans to poor comrades, financed trading enterprises, and bought up debts. Some of them became de facto bankers, controlling the cash flows of entire regions. Real financial clans formed within the slave community. Underground markets existed in all major cities. Here, stolen goods were sold, coins from different provinces were exchanged, and forged documents were distributed. They operated under the protection of corrupt officials and influential patrons, which made them stable and long-lasting. The maritime slave trade was particularly well developed. Slave porters and sailors secretly transported valuable goods, sometimes hiding entire batches in the holds of ships. Thanks to this, many slaves became wealthy, and some became intermediaries between large merchants. Land trade was based on the use of caravan routes and Roman roads. Slave drivers, guides, and translators had unique opportunities for trade, as they knew the prices in different cities and could earn money from arbitrage. The trade and services became another source of income. Skilled slaves, builders, musicians, doctors, teachers were rented out by their owners or worked part-time. Sometimes these incomes significantly exceeded the official value of the slave. The financial transactions of slaves were surprisingly complex. They exchanged currency, transferred money between cities, and insured cargo. Some slaves became real bankers, although they had no legal right to engage in such activities. Investments were made through proxies, most often through freedmen. Wealthy slaves invested money in real estate, workshops, and commercial enterprises. In this way, hidden commercial empires were created, formally owned by free people, but actually controlled by slaves. Colleges of slaves often acted as courts. They settled trade disputes, established rules, and punished violators. The decisions of such assemblies were recognized by the entire community, which turned the colleges into unofficial, self-governing bodies. Slave trading dynasties became a reality. Children inherited not only peculium, personal savings, but also trade connections, secrets of successful operations, and the family's reputation. Some dynasties controlled entire sectors. For example, the supply of wine, oil, or fabrics in a particular region. Thus, the secret trading networks of slaves were not just a means of survival. They became an independent economic force that influenced markets, connected cities, and formed an invisible parallel economy of the Roman Empire. The ninth secret of Roman slaves was that they developed a whole system of covert resistance to their masters. Unlike open revolts, which rarely ended in success, these methods were quiet, almost invisible. but caused enormous and long-term damage to slave owners. Sabotage in production was the most common tactic. Slaves deliberately damaged tools, overloaded mechanisms, and left subtle defects in their work. They made accidental mistakes in calculations, substituted materials, or failed to complete the tasks assigned to them. The scale of sabotage was so great that Roman writers, such as Collegia, gave advice to landowners on how to deal with this hidden threat. Slowing down the pace of work became a real art. Slaves learned to work in a minimum punishment mode, not too slowly to provoke anger, but not too quickly to bring maximum profit to their master. This tactic seemed inconspicuous, but on the scale of large estates or workshops, it led to colossal losses. Spoiling food and goods caused direct material damage. A cook could oversalt or overcook food, a winemaker could spoil a batch of wine, and a craftsman could make a product with an internal defect. Sometimes slaves deliberately broke expensive dishes or ruined fabrics. Such actions, when frequent, undermined the master's prosperity. Leaking information was a powerful weapon. Slaves had access to the most intimate details of their masters' lives. They eavesdropped on conversations, intercepted letters, and observed negotiations. They passed this information on to competitors, enemies, or even the authorities. It is known that many political intrigues and failures began precisely with the betrayal of slaves. Coalitions of slaves against their masters were another form of resistance. Each member of such a group played their part. A cook could slip poison into food, a gatekeeper could let robbers into the house, a manager could falsify accounts and steal money. Sometimes such coalitions destroyed the economy from within for years, remaining elusive. Psychological pressure turned into a form of moral terror. Slaves spread rumors of curses, staged strange omens and mystical events, and created an atmosphere of fear. Superstitious owners began to believe that the gods were angry and sometimes even refused to mistreat their slaves or release them. Corruption among overseers and managers was commonplace. Slaves bribed them with food, money, or services. In return, overseers turned a blind eye to violations, allowed more rest than was allowed, or did not report misdemeanors. Thus, the disciplinary system was eroded from within. Exploiting the superstitions of their masters was one of the most sophisticated methods. Slaves found bad omens, interpreted dreams in an unfavorable light, and predicted illness and misfortune. The Romans' belief in signs and magic made such techniques very effective. The sexual resistance of female slaves was expressed in attempts to control their own bodies. Women used herbal contraceptives and feigned illness to avoid violence. Some became mistresses of their masters or their sons, using their position to protect other slaves and obtain privileges. Religious resistance manifested itself in the refusal to participate in pagan rituals, in the secret worship of their own gods, in curses in the name of the Christian God or the Jewish Yahweh. For slaves who belonged to forbidden cults, religious protest was a form of inner freedom and a challenge to the system. Intellectual resistance was the lot of educated slaves, writers, philosophers, historians. They criticized slavery in allegorical form, ridiculed cruelty and injustice, and laid the groundwork for ideas of future liberation. Some of these texts were destroyed, but others have survived and give us an idea of the hidden opposition within Roman society. Thus, the hidden methods of resistance used by slaves became no less dangerous a weapon than open revolts. They undermined the slave system from within, made it less effective, and ultimately contributed to its weakening. The 10th and most important secret of Roman slaves was the various ways of obtaining freedom that went far beyond the official procedure for manumission. Slaves developed many legal and illegal methods of gaining freedom. Self-redemption was the most common method of liberation. Slaves saved money for years to buy their freedom. The price ranged from 500 to 10,000 sesterces, depending on the slave's skills, age, and beauty. Many masters willingly sold freedom, making a good profit. Merit to the master often led to liberation. Slaves who saved their master's life, uncovered conspiracies, or brought in large profits were rewarded with freedom. Some slaves specifically sought opportunities to distinguish themselves. Testamentary emancipation was a popular form of manumission. Many masters freed slaves in their wills, sometimes all of their slaves at once. This was considered a sign of piety and ensured the master a good reputation after death. Religious manumission took place in temples of various gods. Slaves bought their freedom from the deity, formally becoming sacred slaves, but in fact gaining independence. This method was especially popular in the eastern provinces. Military service opened the way to freedom for physically strong slaves. They enlisted in the auxiliary troops, served for 25 years, and received Roman citizenship. Many preferred the risks of military service to guarantee slavery. Marriages to free citizens automatically granted freedom to female slaves in some cases. The law was complex, but clever female slaves found ways to use it to their advantage. Many sham marriages were entered into for this very purpose. The adoption of slaves by free citizens was a rare but existing practice. Childless citizens sometimes adopted talented slaves, giving them not only freedom, but also an inheritance. This required a special relationship between master and slave. The political activities of some slaves led to their liberation by the authorities. Slaves who informed on rebels and spied for Rome were granted freedom by the emperor or provincial governors. Self-proclaimed freedom was a last resort for desperate slaves. They simply declared themselves free, changed their names, and moved to other cities. In the chaos of large cities, such people could live for years without arousing suspicion. Collective liberations occurred during times of social upheaval. Civil wars, barbarian invasions, and natural disasters created conditions in which thousands of slaves gained actual freedom. Many of them never returned to slavery. Family emancipations united slave relatives in the struggle for freedom. If one member of a family was emancipated, he used all means to redeem his relatives. Family solidarity was a powerful force in the struggle for freedom. Conditional freedom meant gradual liberation through a system of obligations. The slave got freedom, but had to work for their former owner for a few more years, pay off their debt, and do certain duties. It was a compromise between slavery and complete freedom. The secret life of Roman slaves turned out to be much richer and more complex than is commonly believed. Behind the facade of powerlessness and submission lay a whole world with its own laws, traditions, economy, and culture. Slaves were not passive victims of circumstance. They actively fought to improve their situation, using all available means, from accumulating wealth to organized resistance. Many succeeded and gained their freedom. The peculium system shows that even within the framework of slavery, there were opportunities for economic activity. Some slaves became richer than free citizens, which created a paradoxical situation in Roman society. Family ties between slaves were strong, despite the lack of legal recognition. Contubernales created the basis for social stability and the transmission of cultural traditions to future generations. Colleges and secret slave organizations functioned as a parallel social structure. They provided mutual assistance, protection of interests, and preservation of professional knowledge and cultural traditions. The religious life of slaves was rich and diverse. Syncretic cults united the traditions of different peoples, gave hope for salvation, and created a sense of spiritual equality with their masters. Slave resistance took many forms, from passive sabotage to open revolts. This resistance was a constant factor that all slave owners had to reckon with. The paths to freedom were numerous and varied. Slaves not only waited for the mercy of their masters, but also actively worked for their liberation using both legal and illegal methods. Studying the secret lives of slaves shows that the human spirit cannot be broken by any form of oppression. Even under the harshest conditions of slavery, people found ways to preserve their dignity and fight for a better life. Roman slavery was not a monolithic system of oppression, but a complex social institution with many internal contradictions. These contradictions ultimately led to its gradual disappearance. Contemporary historians are revising traditional ideas about Roman slavery. Archaeological finds, epigraphic data, and literary sources show that slaves were active participants in Roman society. The secret life of Roman slaves reminds us that behind any system of oppression, there are real people with their own dreams, plans, and struggles. The history of slavery is not only a history of suffering, but also a history of human resistance and the pursuit of freedom. What aspect of the secret life of Roman slaves surprised you the most? Do you think slaves could have really influenced the development of Roman society? Are there any parallels between the situation of Roman slaves and modern forms of labor relations? Share your thoughts in the comments.